Welcome back to the Contrarian, everybody. It's my pleasure to bring on a returning guest, Mr. Dave Collum. He's a professor of organic chemistry at Cornell University. He's very well thought out in terms of his arguments and stances on things like the economy and vaccines, climate change. He's very well informed on all of these things. He's the writer of a pretty legendary Year in Review. So, without further ado, Mr. Dave Collum, thank you for coming on again.
Oh, it's always my pleasure. Yeah, it has been a while, so yeah, a lot to
It
talk
has
about.
been, for sure. And maybe to get started, we could talk about the economy and the whole the talk of a recession and where you see that likelihood being, because we've had the recent fourth quarter GDP came in stronger than expected, and then of course the markets rallied on that. And um, I'm guessing, what are your thoughts regarding a recession? Do you think it's unavoidable at this point, that we're still going to enter into one? Do you think it's maybe a little up in the air? What are your thoughts with regards to an economic recession on the coming year?
Um, Here's the first funny thing. People treat the recession like it's a car accident or something, and that if you don't have one, then you didn't have an accident. If you do have one, then you did. There's no bright demarcation between no recession and recession. When you cross into recession, you've just gotten a little bit deeper into some problem. Um, I have two issues. One is recessions which don't last long, right? The worst recessions are maybe 2 years, something like that, and bear markets which can last for what seems like eternity. Uh, Most people, I think, are probably more afraid of the bear market than the recession. The recession's kind of a proxy
Yeah.
because a lot of people don't think they're going to lose their job in the recession. But they think of the recession as, oh, but my 401k is going to go to crap, right? Um, I think the markets are, the don't fight the Fed model. Uh, I've learned the hard way that that's true. I didn't realize over the years what the Fed would do. I equate it with having sex with barnyard animals. Some of the things that they do, and I didn't believe that they would do that, but sure enough, there they are. That Fed's having sex with chickens, and so now the message is don't fight the Fed, and the market seems to want to do that, and I find that a little mysterious. So, to me, the markets are easily 2x overvalued. And I've got 25 metrics of valuation, and they all point to 2x overvalued. So if you have your favorite one for some reason you think it's not 2x overvalued, I will carpet bomb you with 25 more that show 2x overvalued. And they all roughly coincide. And somehow over the next unknown number of years, we have to give that back because regression to the mean is something that you will never stop. You're always going to regress to the mean. And the only way out of this one, in theory, is that you never regress to the mean and that we just stay up in the stratosphere for eternity. And if by chance we do that, then since they're 2x overvalued, your returns as a profit-making enterprise, as a cash flow-based system, are half. And so if the PE is twice what it ought to be, then the earnings are half what they ought to be in terms of amount of money invested. So there's really no way out of this, in my opinion. Meanwhile, you've got a Fed that I think is simultaneously the best way it was put was by Peter Bookfire. One time I was on a panel discussion with him, and I was probably the most bearish guy, but we're all bearish. Jim Stack was there and Jimmy Iorio was there. It was fun, actually. It was just that the panel organizer completely lost control of the panel. We just went wild. And Bookfar said the Fed has been truly humiliated by the inflation, and I think humiliation is a good word because back probably 2 years ago, Stephen Roach wrote an article about Powell looking like Arthur Burns, which for those who are not familiar with Fed governors, he's the one who let the '70s inflation get out of control, uh, creating sort of nonstop alibis about how it was transitory, and then eventually he finally realized it wasn't, and it was out of control, and so he basically gets ushered off stage, and they bring in the big guns, and then we have a very painful period. I think that there's two camps. One is that there's a camp that thinks Powell is a swamp creature and that he will do what he's told to do to save the markets, which I'm not convinced he can do. But let's pretend like he can. The price of that will be to destroy the currency. Destroy is too strong a term because it will just be wounded more. But he will let inflation burn hot for a very long time. I don't know what happens when the markets figure out that that's what he's doing, because to me, that's actually the bad news. That means that we've got no one driving the cab. And the market should start pricing, cash flows and cash flows from the bond market and cash flows from the equity market and cash flows from everything else market. They had to start repricing them because one of the panel members made reference to how the 2-year yields at 3 or 4% are sort of hard to avoid, right? They go, oh yeah, those are really appealing. I go, not if inflation is 15.
Yeah.
So and they're saying inflation is 6, not if you live on planet Earth. There's just no chance inflation is 6%. The price of eggs in some part of the country is $8 a dozen. I just had some work done in my house. I couldn't believe how expensive it was.
Yeah.
Ribeyes that I used to buy for half of what I'm now paying. I go to a diner. I know what the price was of their blue plate special. There's just nothing out there that's remotely cheap compared to a year ago. And so if he wants to let it burn, at some point the markets are going to go, holy crap, we have to reprice these risk assets because they're not going to return even the rate of inflation. I mean, the real rate of return is going to be negative. So I think it's dangerous for Powell to let inflation burn hot. I think at some point he will regret that if he chooses that path. There's a question I like to ask people: when was the last time a country inflated its way out of debt? And it turns out to be a trickier question than many people think. So you get real quick hip shoot kind of answers like, well, Weimar Germany. They actually didn't. They were unsuccessful inflating their way out. They basically fought their way out at some level, defaulted their way out. So most inflations end up also, the end game is a default,
Okay.
right? Germany's sovereign debt didn't go away just because they destroyed the mark, the German mark. Some people said Argentina. I go, no, they've defaulted 6 times in a century, so they don't. Clever answer came up with one was Canada, and I actually fished around, and Canada did have a pretty big sovereign debt problem in the sort of late '80s, maybe early '90s. A little vague to me right now, but they kind of blocked and tackled their way out. But if you look at the inflation rate, it wasn't the inflation that did it. They just kind of did it through austerity. They just did it, and their economy did well. Their resource-based economy did pretty well. So they kind of just dug their way out. And the best answer turns out to be the United States post World War II, where they had a big war debt, and they financially repressed the bond markets. A lot of people don't know this. I didn't know this until fairly recently. They pushed interest rates to negative 10% real yield. It got really bad. The bond market got destroyed. The bond market was a killing field post-war. And by the way, it is the reason why Jeremy Siegel spouts the garbage he spouts about equities always win. It's that bond market averaged into the equation. If you look at the rest of the history of the United States, Jeremy Siegel's full of crap. According to Ed McQuarrie, if you want to look it up. And so maybe we inflated our way out of our post-war debt, but then again, you have to remind yourself that the U.S. was something like 80% of the global GDP. We own the world. We were the reserve currency. We had so many things going for us. We're such a dominant force to say, do you really want to give inflation the credit for getting out of that debt? I don't think. I think a clever person with a good bean counter could actually calculate the percentage. In fact, I think it would probably be trivial. I'm just too lazy. The percentage of that inflation took away from the debt versus the percentage that we just grew like crazy, grew gigantic smokestack industries. My my son gave me Life and Time magazine from the date that I was born. He got them off the web, off the internet, the World
Okay.
Wide Web. And it was 1955, April 25th. And I went through it. It was a fascinating exercise to see what the world looked like, the date that I was born. And Time magazine were the advertisements for smokestack industry, Alcoa, General Motors, and they weren't trying to sell products. They were boasting about how phenomenal they were. It was really big, big stuff. Life magazine was consumer. Life magazine was the chick in the skirt with the new blender, trying to sell you crap. The most notable thing was in the two magazines, I only found one cigarette ad. How weird is that? I would have said they were all over.
Yeah,
There's only
and
one.
still pretty common to see now. Yeah.
Yeah. So the key though is that we were just wallowing in economic firepower. So we didn't really inflate our way out of that either. So in any event, so here's Powell getting yelled at by Roach, calling him Arthur Burns. And then in jumps Larry Summers a few months later and says, yeah, he looks like Arthur Burns to me too. So Powell, as an elderly gentleman, has got to decide whether he is going to be a savior of markets and a destroyer of currency, or he's going to be a savior of the Fed's reputation and his legacy. And I think he's been pretty clear that he intends to whip this inflation, whip inflation now. And he said there's going to be pain, and he said it repeatedly, and he's warning us. And then here's this silly situation where things look like they're turning down, right? They have this feel, and every once in a while some number comes in good. They say, oh, fantastic, we're not going into a recession. Well, there are things all over the place that are tanking out there. And let's say maybe they're not tanking. Then Powell's going to keep raising interest rates.
Yeah.
He's not going to stop until it. I had a stubborn child at one point, and I had to deal with him. I had to keep pushing and pushing him, and I used to think, why do I have to push you to the point that you end up in tears? Can't we resolve this little problem before you end up in tears? And the answer is no. And I think the markets are acting that way. So I think Powell's going to have to beat them down.
Even more so than he already has.
Oh, well, where are the markets right now? What's the Dow doing?
They're definitely fighting. They're definitely fighting the direction that Powell wants it to go.
Well, I think the Dow's within a few percent of its all-time high.
Yeah, they're close.
Right?
Yeah,
and the Nasdaq's trying to rally back, and so I think there's a number of companies, as Ted Oakley said in a recent podcast. There's going to be a number of companies that cease to exist. None of those have shown up yet. None. And so there has been no overt damage of the kind you expect to see in a serious recession.
Yeah.
And so Powell's going to keep going. Why not? The risk is that it's like the guy in his backyard that's making a YouTube video, which he's tried to light a bunch of leaves, and he's throwing more and more gas on, and somehow he's not getting the fire to light. He puts on more gas. At some point, it's going to light.
Yeah.
And I once referred to it as a monetary capacitor, where you charge it up and charge it up and charge it up, and then finally, whack, it discharges.
Yeah.
And if the markets let Powell crank the rates even higher by not scaring him, then it's just going to be an unbelievable mushroom cloud on the horizon when the markets finally respond.
when
So
it
like any,
does all light up
yeah,
and
it's like being in California and saying, it's great. The San Andreas Fault has not moved in 100 years. This is fantastic. Or, oh, look at that. We've had 25 feet of snow up on the ski slope, and there've been no avalanches. Let's get a lift ticket. Let's go up there, right? Any system displaced from equilibrium, a long ways from equilibrium.
yeah.
When it returns abruptly, owing to the faintest little vibration, and it causes massive destruction. That's what a bomb is. That's what an avalanche is. That's what an earthquake is. It's return to equilibrium the hard way.
Yeah, do you
And
almost think we need to reach a point where things really do start breaking before Powell pivots or pauses? Like, what do you think are some things that would scare the Fed at this point? Would it be, I mean, is it inflation? Does inflation just come down, say, to 3% and then they back off? Is it
well, Volcker
employment?
got faked out several times, and
Yeah,
several times Volcker thought he'd slayed inflation, and then it came roaring back. And I have this funny feeling that if an organic chemist in Ithaca knows this, that probably somebody in the Eccles buildings knows this. I can't rule out the possibility that building's filled with clueless idiots, but I think probably not, right? And one time someone said something to Greenspan, and he said, "You don't think we know this?" And the answer is, yeah, calling the entire Federal Reserve and its 600 economists stupid probably is not a smart move.
yeah.
They could be single-minded, right? They could be in an echo chamber, but they're not stupid. And so I think the other thing Jim Stack said, he said, if you actually look at bear market bottoms and how long it takes for them to form after the Fed starts lightening up, he says it can take quite a while. That bear can rip.
Yeah.
I think we're looking at a generational bear market. I think the V bounces are gone. That's my prediction. That's my hairy ass prediction right there. That's that the age of V bounces is over. They were an artifact of being able to drop interest rates from 16 down to 0. And now
Yeah.
we've run out of room. You go, well, interest rates are now up to what, 3% or something. It's like, really? That's impressive to someone? That's it's like he tapped the brakes, and instead of doing 100 miles per hour, we're now doing 95. We got no brakes left. I keep groping for a metaphor that explains how absurd the markets look to me. But I think we will. The best models in Nikkei. The
Oh,
best
yes.
models in Nikkei, right? And the old models are not good models, right? It's going to be new and special in its own way. But I think the Nikkei is as good as any. That's the idea of a protracted bear market.
So where now you're barely just revisiting the highs set back in '89, and that's 30 years.
I will start getting enthusiastic about buying general equities when the S&P's in the teens.
So yeah, under $2,000. So
Right.
That's
where the teens are.
a ways away from here.
Yeah, and the market keeps saying screw you. Market keeps saying we're not going to let you get there. And I actually believe Powell's not only been embarrassed by inflation, but he's been embarrassed by the markets. So he's trying to say, look, you guys, you're speculating your asses off now. This is crazy.
Yeah.
And I've got to tap the brakes because things are just not working right now. And the markets just keep flipping them off. And I think, will he do it this time? What is it? Tomorrow, I think he's supposed to do something to the rates.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be shocked if he didn't do the 25 basis point trick. The markets are all salivating and went with something bigger.
Yeah.
And just 50 would be a shock because they're going, oh, we all had him priced at 25. Yeah. And he told us to screw ourselves. Right? It's a different Fed.
Yeah, what do you think? You're saying inflation, maybe in the last year during 2021, when they were constantly saying it's transitory and then it wasn't. Do you think it was that shifted the Fed and specifically Powell from being extremely dovish as he was then, which was arguably waiting way too long to start raising rates and QT? Yeah, what do you really think it was that made
So
it shift so dramatically?
the Fed kept, I will amplify on a trite phrase, the Fed kept rates way too low, way too long, way too
Yeah.
many times.
Yeah.
And uh, the thing that the Fed occasionally mutters that's correct is about inflation expectations. One point not so long ago, Alice Rivlin came up and said that no one in the markets is familiar with inflation at this point, right? Recognizing that inflation, that dragon had been slayed so well. Now, again, we all know the numbers are crap, but it hasn't been rearing its head in a way that forced the Fed to play their hand. And then she went on to say, and therefore, I don't think inflation's a problem. So she's saying
Hmm.
because we're not aware of it, it's not a problem. That's her way of saying inflation expectations won't come back either. Well, I think that the lockdown was not the cause of inflation. It didn't help. The lockdown was the spark. So the lockdown finally said, holy shit, there's inflation. And as soon as it started getting discussed, all of a sudden it was like the brain chemistry of a mob changed.
Yeah.
And it went from you going, okay, this is big crowd of people that are just kind of milling around. All of a sudden someone starts getting angry. So all of a sudden I think inflation got into the DNA. And to use a COVID metaphor. And now, so for example, I ask, my favorite question is to find a contractor and say to them, okay, imagine you're going to build a house or build a garage or pave a driveway or something 2 years from now. What are you going to add to your estimate to account for rising wages and materials?
So unknown at this point. Yeah.
Well, but the standard answer is 30%.
So they're factoring in a good
15 a
close to
year.
15% annualized. Yeah.
That's right. And that means that as they start to, take out their pens and pencils and write bids,
Yeah.
they're adding inflation. So it's in the DNA. It's already there.
Okay.
That's true if you're a labor union too. If you're going to sign a contract, if you're going to sign a 3 or 5 year contract for your wages, you got to sign one for a 2% wage increase.
That sounds like a ripoff right now.
It sure does, doesn't it?
2%, what the Fed is supposedly saying is their target. It sounds way underball right now. So I see what you're saying with regards to people's expectations. Do you think it's possible, though, like with the bullwhip effect, as it's talked about, for example, during 2021, when all those supply chain issues were going on and prices went up dramatically, do you think it's possible that kind of is catching up with us now and that'll help in the disinflation
well, it will. It will. It'll produce a false dawn. So it's the tsunami that washed over our heads. Then we say, okay, it's now receding.
Yeah.
And then the second wave shows up. And so I think that it will be a false dawn, because I think that first tsunami was transitory. Right. So when lumber went up fivefold, that was not a sustainable fivefold.
No. It's
no,
down.
But what might have been sustainable is 15%.
Yeah.
And that is catastrophic. Now, how catastrophic? Well, an interesting example. I started thinking about this. I've actually monitored Cornell faculty salaries since I started. I didn't monitor them since I started, but I went back to when I started because I know what my offer was. And as chair, I knew what we were offering. And I went to one of my old colleagues and said, back when I got here, you were one of the most highly paid guys in the department, right? He said, yeah. And I said, could you tell me what you were paid? He said, yeah. And he told me what he was paid back in 1980. And so I knew the ratio of elite faculty to nouveau grunt faculty hoping to succeed. And then I had access to the salaries as chair, and I looked at what the highest paid salary was and what our offers were, and the ratio hadn't changed. I thought maybe the rich got richer, the poor got poorer. I thought maybe there was an expansion.
Mm-hmm.
No, not at all. So then what I did is I also know what I got paid as a stipend in grad school and what our stipends were at that point too, and that ratio hadn't changed. So the three salaries of the three groups I knew over 40 years stayed locked together. And so here's the thing. A couple of years ago, actually 10, when the great recession showed up. The reason people like to call it a recession is because the recession is just the downslope. And you're out of it the second it turns up. I go, yeah, so you go down into a deep sand trap. You're a golfer, you play golf, deep sand trap,
Yeah.
Turns back up. Are you out of the trap yet? I don't think so.
No.
But they like to say, oh, now you're out because it's turned up. I go, no, I would call it you're out when you've regained what you had before you went in. But they don't like that. If you actually looked at that, it would take much longer to get out.
Yeah.
And so 1 year they gave us no raise in the heat, the inferno of the Great Recession. And I estimated that the 2.5 million SAT points representing the faculty, 3 business schools, no one seemed to notice how screwed we got. Because when they don't give you a raise, let's say it was a 3% inflationary year, and you got no raise. So imagine you're a young punk. You're not getting that back. So the following year, you might get your 3% raise, but you're not getting. They're not going to give you a 6 and say, "Oh, look, we gave you nothing last year. Then we're going to give you a big, huge, fat one this year." No, that's not how it works. So that 3% follows you your whole career. The miracles of compounding work backwards too. And so at the end of your career, you will have forfeited an annual salary because that 1 year when they didn't give you a raise. Well, I think it was last year when inflation was running around 8 or 9% conservatively, we got about a 3% raise. So we gave up another 5% now. And that will follow you to the end of your career. Now I'm 67, so the miracle of compounding doesn't work when you're old, both in the normal sense and in the salary model. But if you're some young punk, you've now lost 8, 9% of your salary for the rest of your career.
Yeah.
And that now adds up to a couple of salaries you just lost.
Yeah. Another topic related to employment that we talked about roughly a year ago, but it really hasn't changed since then, is that even though wages have gone through significant inflation, there's still significant issues in terms of staffing and just businesses being unable to find employees after the pandemic. So I know about a year ago we talked about maybe there was something having to do with illegal immigrants just didn't want to come back to the U.S. after
or couldn't
come back. Although you think they could with the border being how it is, but
but there were also relationships ripped apart. So there were illegal immigrants who had very steady kind of employment, and all of a sudden they came back to a severed ties. So maybe the Mexican workers had 20 different yards they were taking care of. Well, now those relationships got broken, so they had to get reassembled.
Yeah.
So that's the problem. But there's other problems too. There's people who sat out on their deck and said, this is pretty good, sitting around just drinking beer, and I was going to retire in 3 or 4 years, but I've got the money I need because we're still in a bubble.
Yeah.
And then there's people who homeschooled their kids, and they were previously using daycare and maintaining their job, and pretty much it's a wash for many of them, right? So you do the daycare costs and the job, you're not paid that much, but somehow you say, okay, well, we'll struggle through this period. They might have said, screw it, I'm staying home with the kids because we
Yeah.
did it before. And by the way, I'm reading the headlines, I'm watching news stories about how they're teaching kids incredibly bad garbage in school. So I'm going to keep homeschooling my kids. And you got daycare facilities because of the legality of how many kids any one worker can take care of. They can't open the daycare facilities, or they can't open it to as big a group as they used to. So now some parent has to stay home to take care of the kid because there's no slots in the daycares.
Yeah.
The daycare workers weren't paid shit. And so they might say, I'm staying home with my own kid. This isn't worth it.
No, I think in each of those categories you mentioned, I can think of some people that come to mind of just people I've known
Right.
who've shifted their lifestyles a little bit as a result of the pandemic. I guess in my mind, it maybe doesn't make up these tens of millions of employees that seem to just have vanished off the U.S. labor force, but
Well, some died,
it's
right?
yeah, that is a result as well. But it's just it's interesting to see how the wages are now at the levels that they were talking about for a while in terms of whether it was the minimum wage argument or whatever that was, but it's now just inflation has eaten so much of that away that um, it's still not worth working some days.
So what it says, once in a while, someone will say this is a strong labor market, and I say no, it's not. It's a broken labor market. It's not a strong labor market. Strong labor market's when there's we're running out of workers because we're just cranking. A broken labor market is when the workers exist and they're saying, screw you, I'm not doing it.
Yeah.
And so right now we have a price discovery problem where the people who are selling labor and the people who are buying labor can't agree. So we're more in a kind of a buyer strike, a seller strike. And to get those workers out, we're going to have to pay them more. To pay them more, we're going to have to charge more. And I just had a French drain put in my driveway. And I know they load all sorts of crap onto the bill. I live on a lake, and they come down, they look at the lake, and they go, "Oh, for you." And so I try to find out how they're going to charge before they see my house.
Yeah.
But the labor charge was $60 an hour. Now, I don't know what percentage the guy got paid, but I bet it's more than he used to get paid.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
But that's it's a much higher figure than you're usually seeing on
right.
even contracting work, which can run more expensive. But no, that's just an interesting thing I wanted to touch on is the continuing problem of labor shortages. Maybe shifting gears a little bit now to central bank digital currencies, is the Fed is supposedly launching theirs this year, as well as a bunch of other central banks. I wonder what your thoughts are surrounding CBDCs, if that's really going to change very much, or is it really something that's maybe playing more in with the Fed's plan of wanting to just have more control over the economy and the whole monetary system? What are your thoughts on the CBDC area?
Well, there's a gradient. You can start out with the idea that we already have a digital currency. So what are they talking about, right?
Yeah.
You could say, well, they want to put it on some blockchain somewhere, and I go, okay, still, what are you talking about? Ken Rogoff, if you read articles about central bank digital currencies and going totally digital, cash to me is a civil liberty that we should fight to the death to keep.
Yes.
The minute they get rid of all cash, then you no longer have the ability to go silent. And if you read articles even from years ago, they would talk about how the reason we need digital currencies is because all the bad guys sell their drugs and their 5-year-olds that they're ushering over the border, which we seem to be aware of is a profound problem, but we have yet to catch a single person actually buying one of these children. And you got to wonder, why are the purchasers of young children not getting caught and strung up by the neck until dead?
Yeah.
The answer is because children are expensive, and therefore these people are wealthy and powerful. It's got to be the case. We could catch these guys. So I actually am a believer in a global pedophile ring. I believe that
Yeah.
must exist because there's too many kids being trafficked and no one getting caught.
Well, yeah, there
So,
was Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, and nothing happened as a result of all that.
but that even undermines the idea because legally they were trafficking in underage girls, but some of these girls were sort of 16 or 17 going on 25. That's a different kind of pedophilia than buying a 5-year-old.
Yeah.
And those girls can't legally make their own decision, but you can imagine them making their own decision. You can imagine them willingly walking into that relationship. And again, society's decided that's not acceptable, and I agree with society, but again, it's on a different level. And so there's that. I can't remember what was. CBDC, right?
Yeah.
So one point I gave Rogoff some guff in an email, and he said, "Well, read my book." And so I finally read his book. Without fail, they get some depth into the story of catching evildoers using digital currency. They eventually say, "Oh, by the way, this is an aside. It'll make monetary policy easier too."
Yeah.
Which means that they can, if they want you to spend, which is complete utter absurdity. We should be saving, right? Actually, history shows that the society that produces more than they consume and saves, that's a good economy.
Yeah.
So this idea of forcing us to spend is utter absurdity. We should be forcing us to save. That's how capital builds up. But Rogoff is a big fan of this idea of being able to force us. And so if they can make your money rot in your bank account by putting a 3 or 4 or 5% surcharge, we just have no reason whatsoever to keep it in that bank account because you get a negative interest rate that's substantial. That's an authoritarian state. Then you get into the uber ugly layer of CBDC, and you get into the treating money as digital vouchers instead of just a currency. So, money's fungible. If I have $100, I can buy anything I want that costs $100. But programmable digital currency, with the word programmable really critical in this story, is digital currency in which they can say, okay, here's $100, 25 of which is for food, 25 of which is for your mortgage, 25 of which is for the gas in your car. And that you can't use it for the other stuff. You might be able to barter it, right? Say, I'll tell you what, I'll fill your tank if you buy me food.
Yeah.
But that's getting kind of crazy. And they'll probably find some way to stop that. And then often say, since we really care about climate change, then you're only going to get 15 for your gas tank. And you're only going to get 10 of the 25 for food that you can actually spend on animal protein.
Yeah.
And you're going to get only this much because we're pretending that climate change is an important problem. So we're going to tax you for that too, which, by the way, I was a climate change believer up to about 2016 or 17, just because everyone else agreed. So I never dug into it. One point I was sitting with actually the Secretary of Energy, believe it or not. And it's true. And I told him I was agnostic on climate change, and he flinched. I mean, it's like, holy shit, what are you? I was the department chair at that point, so he didn't expect to run into that one inside the halls of academia. And I said, well, you and I both know that for me to actually understand the problem will probably take 10,000 hours. And therefore, I can't personally cast my vote for climate change because I'm just too ignorant. I got goaded by my brother and a doctor who I only know digitally. I have no idea who he is. He sends me emails with stuff in it. My email box is a nightmare now because everyone who wants to get a message out sends it to me. And they both said, how do you know it's real? I said, well, everyone I know believes it. I don't think there's a credible scientist who doesn't believe it, right? This is a pretty standard answer.
Yes. Yeah.
And I'd asked other scientists whether they believe it, and they said yes. So I wasn't totally blowing it out my ass, but and he said, yeah, there are credible scientists who don't believe it. And I said, well, send me some names. And I expected to be Joe Schmuck from Sheboygan State College. And no offense to Sheboygan State College, but I just need more than that. I need someone who's on the front lines of the battle, right? And he sent me a list of names that were elite scientists. I go, okay, but here's what's going to turn out to be the case is they're going to have shot down some model because the math or something didn't hold up right. And that's going to be interpreted as evidence that climate change is not real. So I started Googling these guys to see what they are actually saying. And it turns out they were actually saying that climate change is a complete piece of crap. Nobel Prize winning physicists saying it's all the sun. It has nothing to do with CO2. Former advisors to presidents saying it. Former head of the National Academy of Science is saying it. The biggest hoax in history, according to the former head of the National Academy of Sciences, the founder of Greenpeace saying it. Just you name it. And then I dug in. I said, okay, now you have my attention. And it turns out the whole science, speaking of whack jobs, there's a guy, he calls me every day. It turns out the amount of lying in there is profound lying.
No shocker there.
But. Well, it was a shocker at first.
Oh, okay.
But no shocker now.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you find out the polar bears are starving, and then you find out the biggest expert on Arctic mammals says the polar bear population increased threefold since the 70s. They're starving. It's because they've proliferated.
Yeah.
And I was in the middle of a podcast, a guy named Chris Irons of QTR, and it just clicked in the middle of the podcast. There's this famous picture of a starving polar bear that everyone likes to show. Mm-hmm. And I'm looking at, and then I go, how do you know that polar bear doesn't have stomach cancer? How do you know he's not 40 years old and on his final legs? Because if he's about to go, he's going to look pretty bad, right? Yeah. There's fish under there, and as I said, polar bear get to eat anything they want, right? You don't say no to a polar bear when it's time to eat. And then you find out that the Earth was actually warmer in the Middle Ages. You find out that when glaciers recede, and they're spectacular, right? Before and after photos, 1920, 2020, and the glacier's gone way, way up there. You find out what's underneath those glaciers are 1,200-year-old trees that grew there.
Yeah.
1,200 years ago. Right? And then you find out that they were growing hops in northern England. They can't grow them now because it's not warm enough now. And you find out that, and you find just really crooked science. I got in an argument with one of the big activists. I accused her of, I said this, she provided a link, and I said, well, it looks like fraud to me. And I said, look at figure 26, looks like fraud. She says, how can you say that? It was the burn acreage of Southwest United States. And the first mistake they made is they actually plotted the sum of the burn acreage over about a half a century. Now, if you plot the sum of death by stray renegade tires rolling down the highway smacking people,
yeah,
or steam burns from who knows what, it will steadily rise. So that's a lousy way to plot. It will always raise, oh, look at the problem we have. Look at all those steam birds. Yeah, well, if you actually plot the per year, you get a much better read. And then I noticed, she said, well, you have to read the primary. Oh, they had divided it into the burn acreage due to nature and the burn acreage due to man-made climate change. I'm going, you can't make that distinction. At that point, I realized that there's just no mathematical model that can tease those two apart, period. Land management is a profound contributor to burn acreage, right? And I said, that's bullshit. And she said, you have to read the primary paper. So I went and read it. And it turns out that the primary paper had the same plot. It was more sciencey looking, less visually retrievable. They had redrawn it for the report. And everything was the same except for in the paper it said, the y-axis said model. And they had taken the word model out. And you can say, well, that's trivial, except for the fact that model is a reminder that they actually don't know what they're talking about. It's a model.
Yeah.
And some models are good and some models are bad, but they decided to take the word model out because it was like saying, well, let's just take that out because it's, people will question it. So there's famous climate scientists whose emails got made public who said, we got to lie about this to keep the narrative going. And there's scandals, there's all sorts of things. And by the way, I can promise you as a scientist, having submitted many grant proposals, and having asked colleagues if they agree, even ones who think climate change could be real, if you submitted a grant proposal that actually had data that suggested you were going to show that climate change is not a problem, would you ever get funded? And everyone agrees, no. You will not get funded to disarm the climate change story, period.
So it's
from
really
any agency.
Really, it's a grift of epic proportions at this point.
Well, they're estimating 150 trillion over the next 30 years.
That's so pretty big.
150 trillion buys an awful lot of liars.
Yeah.
And what it also does is those unwilling to lie lose their platform. So what you'll find is the climate change deniers, a lot of old men, a lot of old physicists. Steve Koonin, Caltech physicist, chaired the American Physical Society's committee. It was assembled to look at climate change. And he brought in Freeman Dyson, a globally famous, historically important physicist from Princeton, and a dozen other physicists. And they looked at the climate change world. They concluded it was crap, the sorry state of affairs. Stanford physicists pointed out that if you actually just simply propagate error, which is where you say, look, you got a reading, it could be plus or minus 3%, got another reading that then multiplies another plus or minus 3%. So if you simply propagate error, he says, I'm not a climate scientist, I just know how to propagate error. Says their projection of a 3-degree change has an error bar of 15 degrees.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's garbage. A friend of mine who's a former vice president of one of the biggest companies in the world, a sciencey company, but I can't tell you who, said that he says, I just say to people, look, it's a whole monstrous pile of nonlinear equations which you can't solve. So the people claiming to solve these equations and claiming to predict, it's not possible. It is not possible. And then you find things like the correlation of CO2 and temperature over the last 500,000 years is spectacular, with one problem. The CO2 appears with an 800-year lag to the temperature. So what happens is the temperature warms up and the CO2 appears. That is freshman chemistry. You heat the water, the CO2 starts degassing. So if you heat the oceans, you'll get CO2. So that story's crap. Now you start replaying the tape. You go, oh, we just went through COVID. We just went through this. We're in Ukraine, right? I don't think there's a major issue in the world right now that you couldn't tear to shreds by digging into it. I think every one of the really major issues are a pack of lies at this point. I know I sound jaded, just a little tiny bit, but jaded. I wrote about Ukraine this year.
Yeah, no, I read your year in review. It's called All Roads Lead to Ukraine, and it's
Right.
pretty remarkable. Um, the initial direction we were going was CBDCs, and I'm wondering what
Yeah, I
level of
took you to climate
importance.
change, just a vent. Just a vent.
I was going to ask you about that anyway, so
Okay, that's
I'm
good.
glad we
That's
went
good.
there. But to what degree do you think CBDCs are going to play into the coming years? Do you think that's going to be kind of a non-important story, or is that going to be a major
I
focus in
don't
the coming?
know. If
Yeah,
it is an important story, then then my major topic of 2021 was rising global authoritarianism,
yeah,
and I left it all on the field, like so many athletes this year. Um, I left it all on the field. It was 319 pages of year in review. Try. I challenge you to, at the end of a year, write a year in review that's 319 pages.
yeah.
Um, it took into January. Um, and I stand by it. So I didn't write about it this year because I got it out last year. Um, and I think we're heading there. I think we're at great risk of a global authoritarianism. I'm reading a book right now called The Sovereign Individual, written in 1997.
Okay.
And it's about the tech being the next new era. So you go, oh my God, that's got to be awful because, it's kind of like on a Commodore 64 level of thinking in 1997, right? It's fabulous, actually, because they don't get hung up on the details of the tech. They just see the tech coming. They can just see it. And they said, tech is going to do it. And they talk about 500-year epochs. This is like the fourth turning, but times 4 or 5, right?
Okay.
500-year periods. And say Roman Empire. When it ended, no one knew it ended. They didn't wake up and go, "Holy shit, the friggin' thing collapsed last night," right?
Yeah.
They looked back after a couple hundred years and said, we're sleeping in what used to be Roman baths. We're using them to sleep. Something's gone wrong here, right?
Yeah.
Or you're in Britain and the Romans pulled out and you're living like the Germans again, right? Um, then you go into the era of Charlemagne, which is really the so-called Dark Ages. It was a pretty feudal period. Um, then you go into the next 500 years, which was really the era of the church. And the guy presents these eras in it's a really interesting view of history because he talks about it both economically and as war as a major motivating force. But he talks about the church grew stronger and stronger and stronger and eventually just gutted the system. It became too expensive and too powerful, too centralized power, and that the feudal system just failed. And then we entered the age of sovereign states, and it's really clever. In the feudal era, some king, to get his way, had to get the attention of a small handful of of dukes, shit like that, and he had to somehow convince them to participate in whatever goofy plan he had, um, and get their money out of him, and that was not that easy. And then as the middle class emerged, the system evolved in a way to recognize that it could get much more money by taking just small amounts of money from each of the middle class. And the individuals were not very powerful. And so the sovereign state emerged to suck the lifeblood out of the new middle class that came out of the Dark Ages, came out of the medieval period. And so you could raise huge sums of money, like in a GoFundMe site, where you just small amounts from lots of people.
Hmm.
And now what has happened? Well, what has happened is the sovereign states have become too expensive again. And he makes this interesting. It's this William Rees-Mogg and some other guy named Davidson. They said when the Soviet Union collapsed, people viewed that as a victory for the good guys and a victory for sort of a capitalism-based system. he said that was not it. Actually, the Soviet Union collapsing was the beginning, one of the early events of the collapse of sovereigns. He said the really a better analogy is the Soviet Union collapsing should have been viewed by the West as your fraternal twin just died of old age. You're going,
yeah.
oh, that's not good news. And he talks about collapsing of countries like Peru and stuff like that. And you look at what's going on in society, and you could imagine a sovereign problem. You can imagine people reaching across the globe to get what they need, not from a sovereign, from some other thing, some other mechanism. And that's where they recognize this digitization of the world would inadvertently rip down borders.
Okay.
Now, we think of it as the Great Reset and as a rather evil thing. And he seems to think, and he talks about during the rollovers of these epics, he doesn't call them epics, I do. He says it gets violent, gets crazy. It's not a fun time to exist. It's not a stable period. But he thinks that in the end, the sovereign individual wins. So in some sense, it puts a positive spin on the Great Reset. And if you're reading this book, you're going, this is the Great Reset. He's describing it in 1997.
Before Klaus Schwab was really ever in the mainstream
I think
media.
wasn't on my radar, but that would have been easy to miss too.
Yeah.
But so there's going to be a battle between the sovereigns and the sovereign states and the sovereign individuals is what this guy's predicting.
And so
and it's going to take too long for us to see. You might see it. I don't think I'm going to.
Okay.
I'm going to die of the vaccine.
I hope you get to see it. The good parts of it, anyway.
The good parts come after the bad parts.
I know.
I kind of wanted to wait long enough for me to croak. And I was on a 2-day symposium. In a 2-day symposium, which had finance guys and real estate guys, all sorts of different. And the theme was we're humped, to put it bluntly. And it had a handful of prominent anti-vaxxers, guys. Those who know the anti-vaxxers, Steve Kirsch, Pierre Corey, Brett Weinstein, guys like that.
Okay.
And everybody was talking about prepping. Everybody. Brett, who's an old school liberal, but not liberal like in libertarian liberal, but he's an old school liberal, old school flaming liberal. Let's put it in those terms, right? An old school, just putty headed liberal, although his brain is so big that he's not in any stretch a putty head. And at one point he said, I still am appalled by the horrors that guns have done to society. He says, I stand by that. They're doing terrible things. He says, but the founding fathers had something right, and I now own guns. I'm going, whoa, what just happened, right?
Yeah.
And everyone was talking this way. Now maybe it was set up to be this way, but I was saying, you're not prepped enough, dude. And they had a gun expert talking about how to think about if you have to move, how do you move? How do you pre-plan a move? How do you plan? Very strange symposium. How do you plan for when someone shows up on your doorstep and you've prepped and they haven't? What do you do?
Yeah.
Right? What do you do when a family member does that? And you said, look, here's what you got to do to get ready for the coming rough times. And they go, oh, I'm just going to come to your house. Boy, does that piss them off. Preppers do not want to hear, I just come to your house. My response to that is, I dug into Y2K. And a lot of people are embarrassed by it. They go, oh, God, we screwed that up. No, we did not. What Y2K represents, first and foremost, I knew heavy computer guys who did not know it was going to happen. So there was risk. It doesn't matter whether risk is not what happened, it's what could have happened. And I could not find smart people who could say definitively we'll be fine. So what I did for Y2K is I started putting together the supply chain problem.
Okay.
Which, by the way, has now been rejuvenated, right, in a very big way.
Yeah.
So when COVID showed up, I hit the store fast and hard because I already done the intellectual. If A goes, then B goes, and C goes, you're gonna really regret it. And during the Y2K thing, I looked at this idea that if the connectivities break, what will happen? And you can cascade downhill very quickly, very, very quickly.
Oh yeah.
So if the cops, for example, have to stay home to take care of their family and can't go out there and be cops, which, by the way, they're having trouble doing already. So Y2K didn't happen. I had computer scientists claim, well, we fixed. I go, no, we didn't. That can't be the explanation because there would be problems in other countries that don't know how to get their shit together. And they didn't even have problems. So it wasn't a problem. But I don't know. I'm not a computer scientist. But I did learn this idea of being ready for the what if.
Yeah.
And that's what preppers are about. And people would say to me, well, I'm just going to come to your house. Depending on who I was talking to, I would either, if it was a young person, I'd say, well, bring your mother. Or if it was an older person, I'd say, bring your daughter. To try to shock them a little bit.
Yeah.
You know, obviously, I'm just being a perv, but an overt perv. But I was trying to tell them, I'm not joking. And I would say, look, here's the deal. 100 pounds of rice costs, at that point, probably $20. Why would you not have that in your basement?
Yeah, at the basic level, it makes a lot of sense.
Now, if you're in a 500 square foot, shipping container in San Francisco, you're off the hook for me, right? I sympathize. But if you have the space, you should have the extra toilet paper. You should have the rice. You should have some bouillon. You should have some salt. You should have some canned food. Because you could have a hack, a power outage, an ice storm. It would be a shame to starve because you needed 3 months worth of food and you only had 2 weeks worth of food.
Yeah. And in a scenario like the sovereign nations breaking down, that's a much more significant unfolding. It's
especially now.
Oh, yeah.
Holy cow. All roads lead to Ukraine. Also, all roads are leading to World War III.
Yeah, unfortunately so.
And we don't have anyone driving the cab on our side. At least Russia has Putin. We've got nobody.
Yeah.
NATO is completely rudderless in this story.
It's as if they continue pushing their narrative as, in the absence of seeing that Russia has nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. And it's scary to see, to say the least.
Mm-hmm.
And you do wonder, though, with what you were talking about previously with the Great Reset, how it's almost talking about the sovereign nations breaking down. Is that when a authority like the World Economic Forum is wanting to actually step in and try to make themselves a one world type government?
Well, is
that maybe their plan?
Well, that might be their plan, but the arrogance required to think that somehow it'll be orderly and that you'll just step in, right? So there's people who think that that all this is about eugenics, and I can't refute it. A couple of years ago, I wouldn't have even pondered that. I would have said, no one's that stupid. But there is evidence out there. I can dig up evidence and show you where people are talking. You go, the eugenicists are back at the helm again. And they are convinced that we got to shrink the population. I can even make a case for why it's a logical thing to do. So imagine you're Davos man, right? And I don't know what Davos man is. I read a lot about Davos, but I still look at it and go, I don't know what the hell's going on there. Mm-hmm. But imagine you are at the highest level. You have access to the best information. And that you've realized that with rising China and rising India and Europe wanting its share and us wanting our share, that the world just can't do it.
Resource-wise?
resource-wise. I'm an environmentalist, although I also strongly believe the Earth heals itself very well. Right, the Gulf of Mexico, the gates of hell opened up, oil poured out of the bottom. It really felt like we had done something profound, and then we capped it, and then it kind of went away. Right, you go, well, we're going to have nuclear winter with some big volcano, and then it kind of went away. Right, an asteroid hits, that's a problem, but we don't control that.
Yeah.
So what if Davos man is able to look down and say, look, we're pretending we need electric cars, but there's no chance we can create enough batteries to run these electric cars. We can pretend we're going to use fossil fuel based cars, but we frack the shit out of all the fields we can, and the fracking is really tailing off hard. And we're drilling in very far away places, and we're debating who gets to do the Arctic and stuff like that. This is not Jed Clampett shooting into the side of a hill and having oil come gushing out of the side of the hill, and then you move to Beverly Hills, right? We're in a different world. We're going many miles down to get harder and harder to get resources. Those people who drive electric cars and are pulling muscles, patting themselves on the back for being great people and virtuous people, should take a look at where all the battery materials come from. And what you'll find is that something like 76% of the cobalt comes from gigantic open mine pits in the Congo, in which both adults and kids, tens of thousands of them in one pit, are smacking away on the cobalt reserves with mallets and chopping up and manually carrying it out of the mine. So it's slave labor. So your Prius and your various cars is made with slave labor. So, pat yourself all you want, but I'm going to call you a shithead. Because I'm going to call you an ignorant fool. What I call you is, and you know this, the sanctimony industrial complex. You find something to be sanctimonious about, then you get all revved up. And I get sanctimonious about shit too. So I have my own sanctimonious topics. Happens to be you guys. And so Davos man might be looking, saying, we're on a collision course. What do we do? And one theory is, and I made a call back in 2021. I said, I could imagine realizing that we have to go nuke. Yeah. And I could imagine realizing that we're not going to convince people one at a time. This is not going to be an easy thing. So what do? You create an energy crisis. And as we saw with COVID, Joe Sixpack will beg for a vaccine and nuclear power. As soon as they can't heat their house, they will beg for nuclear power. And that's how I'd do it. If I were king of the world, I go, okay, let's get the plebes to beg for nukes, and then we don't have to screw around with and modern day nukes are phenomenal. So we really, the next move was nukes, and somehow we got all tangled up over a few deaths in Chernobyl. No one died in Fukushima, by the way. No one died in Fukushima.
Yeah,
no one died at 3 Mile Island. The nuke deaths are trivial. There's like 6 nuke deaths in history.
From power plants, they're amazingly clean and efficient.
And the new ones are phenomenal. The new ones are great. And so I'm investing in nuclear power on the bet that it's going to come on faster than people realize.
That the shift back to nuclear power is going to come faster, you're saying?
Once we have a winter with no heat. Right? So I predicted an engineered energy crisis in 2021.
Okay.
Along comes 2022, and what do we have? Something that looks an awful lot like an engineered energy crisis.
Yeah.
What if the war in Ukraine's about cutting off energy?
To Europe and to other Western countries.
Yeah.
And then not.
By the way,
sorry.
The Germans shut down all their nuke plants.
Yeah.
Right. What about them? They might want to revisit that idea.
So.
Oh, and here's the last one.
Okay.
I love this one. China's making all the wind turbines and solar panels.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, they have plans for 100 nuclear power plants. Now let's wrap this up in a tight little ball and point out that China is building all these alternative energies and selling them to us and using the proceeds to build nukes.
They're not building solar, fields of solar
So so
panels or wind farms
so
or.
so they're selling us the crap to buy the good stuff.
You could put it that way. Yeah.
I do put it that way.
So you're saying that EVs and photovoltaics aren't actually that effective of a energy system?
Well, EVs, I mean, no one's figured out how to get the electricity.
Yeah.
Right? You don't, EVs. I have a neighbor, double Cornell educated friends, who get their power. They think they're getting their power from alternative energy.
Hmm.
And I go, there's one power line running down your street.
Yeah.
I've always wondered if the gas tanks with the different grades of gas weren't just all coming out of one big tank, right?
Oh, yeah. That too.
Yeah, give them the good stuff.
Yeah.
And so people are pretty clueless on this topic. They haven't thought it through. They want to, we're seeing articles about how gas stoves cause asthma. Please.
Yeah.
It's like, oh yeah. Gas stoves cause asthma, right?
So I guess if this engineered energy crisis continues to play out, you could see a scenario happen, right, where, power goes down for a few weeks and.
Oh, no. Oh, no.
No?
What got us into World War II? What got us into World War II? I'm pretty close to saying this is not the most debatable thing in the planet at this point.
Okay.
We had our foot on Japan. We forced Japan to counterattack. We had them bound and gagged in so many ways. They couldn't get energy into Japan. We had a total embargo. There was all this chatter in the Pacific. And we left our fleet, but without the carriers. We took them out of there.
Mm-hmm.
Totally exposed to Pearl Harbor. We didn't even have people in guard towers with binoculars, with radios saying, by the way, I just saw a couple Japanese Zeros fly overhead. You might want to wake the troops up.
Yeah.
F Troop had guard towers. We didn't have guard towers. Admiral sent letters to Washington saying, the fleet is exposed. Get them the hell out of there. And they were ignored because we needed to get into World War II and we needed to go big. So we went big. You can't, one of the characteristics of the sovereign state, the 500 years of the sovereign state, is you've got to get people thinking about them being members of a sovereign state, them being members of this big team. Mm-hmm. You can't get people to go off to war to fight Iraqis and Afghans by just flicking them. You got to hurt them. You got to really rally the troops. So what do? You bring down a couple of towers. Mm-hmm. I guarantee you there's not a person out there who still thinks 9/11 was a legitimate attack on the United States. If you go and find the new Pearl Harbor 4-hour documentary and you read it, if that doesn't rattle your cage, I can't help you.
The new Pearl Harbor.
The new Pearl Harbor is the best documentary on 9/11.
Oh, it's on 9/11. It's not on.
Yeah.
Okay.
But Pearl Harbor is the same story. I mean, I don't think Pearl Harbor is a terribly ambiguous situation either. What war did we get into that wasn't, right? We had the Gulf of Tonkin in Vietnam. How about the Gulf War, right? Saddam attacks Kuwait. We got to save the Kuwaitis, right? Mm-hmm. And then you go, oh, here's the interesting thing. Here's some either leaked or declassified State Department documents in which we told Saddam, your dealings with Kuwait are not of interest to the U.S. We teed him up and said, take Kuwait. For all I know, behind closed doors, you take Kuwait, we'll buy their oil from you. And he took the bait. What did we do? We got troops into the Middle East for the first time in a very long time. We got troops in the Middle East. We got Russia to agree to let us put troops in the Middle East.
Yeah.
Pretty clever trick. In
Clever
Ukraine.
trick. And now, yes, I was going to go there. Is you're
Well,
seeing?
Ukraine's a complete catastrophe. It's a disastrous foreign policy problem. It's a disastrous foreign policy problem, and it's not even well hidden. I mean, it's not the people who. If you're listening to this and you're thinking Russia's by definition bad because Russia attacked a sovereign state, you have not read anything. You have not You've not read chapter 1 of this story. Not even chapter 1. And if you want to understand Ukraine, the first thing you got to do is go back and read about the history of Ukraine. You got to read about the last 10 years of what's been going on in Ukraine and the Ukraine-Russian relationship and the NATO-Ukraine relationship. And what you quickly discover is that NATO has been provoking Russia every step of the way for the last dozen years. There's prominent politically wonky characters, like probably the best. If you want to just go watch some YouTubes, go watch Douglas McGregor, go watch John Mearsheimer, go watch Richard Black, go watch Scott Ritter, who's a contentious character. Read stuff by Max Blumenthal, Matt Taibbi, Aaron Mattei, Tucker Carlson.
Yeah, even Tucker.
And
now.
what you will discover is that Russia repeatedly warned NATO, said, look, you can't push eastward. Russia and NATO agreed at the end of World War II that if the Soviet, not at the end of World War II, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the world was at great risk, right? This was a sketchy period.
Mm-hmm.
And there were nukes that were out of control. There were bioweapons labs that were out of control. There were people who were out of control. And a lot of negotiations went on because Germany was reuniting. Now, Russia wasn't the only country nervous about a reuniting Germany. Big Germany has caused a lot of problems.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of people going, oh, boy, the idea of reuniting Germany, that's a real heart warmer. Let me think about that, right? So basically, NATO said to Russia, if you don't reassemble the Warsaw Pact, we will not push NATO eastward. And we'll let that whole series of little banana republics, the Baltic states, just kind of be a buffer zone. And Russia agreed. And it turns out that NATO immediately started planning their push eastward right away. 1997, Bill Clinton made the move. George Kennan, who was one of the most legendary Cold Warriors of the Cold War, famous. I asked Ben Steele of the CFR, what's a great book to read about the Cold War? And he said, read about George Kennan. And so I have it on my wish list. I haven't gotten to it yet. And George Kennan said pushing NATO eastward was the biggest foreign policy blunder in the history of U.S. foreign policy. So we kept pushing eastward. And Russia kept saying, you can't be doing this. You promised. And we kept pushing. And so Ukraine turns out to be the big one. So Russia tolerated a lot of things. But it got to Ukraine. They said, you can't do it because Ukraine gives Russia critical access to ocean-going vessels and to Europe and to things like that. So Russia didn't need to own Ukraine. But Russia needed to keep NATO from owning Ukraine. And as one famous guy said, I think it was George Friedman said, Russia needed to keep its own borders open. That's what Ukraine was about. So starting in the 2014 coup in Ukraine was the CIA-led, CIA-funded, and CIA-armed coup. Against, I can't pronounce their names, so I'm not even going to try. In which we probably knocked off what was probably, I mean, I really start from scratch, so there's big holes in my knowledge here, but probably a Putin puppet, right? The guy running Ukraine was probably close enough to Putin.
Okay.
And we installed our own guy. And that's the famous discussion that got caught on tape, that where Victoria Nuland talking about putting yachts in charge and fuck the EU and things like that. There's a famous phone call that got recorded and released. Releases are always for a purpose, so I never quite know what to do with them. In any event, so all of a sudden now Russia's at risk because now NATO's got its guy in Ukraine. And we keep arming them and training them. And we actually train them with the idea of interoperability, meaning that you can take, it's like Roman legions started this, where you can take any Roman legionnaire and insert him right in another legion, and he can do it because they all use the same disk operating system. So interoperability allows them. So we made Ukrainian soldiers interoperable with NATO soldiers. What was also true is that NATO Cold Warriors, people who seem to forget that the Cold War had ended. I really do think there's people who just have never accepted the idea the Soviet Union is gone. And they looked inside Ukraine and said, well, the people we have to work with are the Azov Battalion. These are these Ukrainian nationals, they call them. Mm-hmm. What the average person is not being told on CNN and really not being told on Fox News, maybe with the exception of Tucker, and certainly not in the mainstream press, is that the Azov Battalion is a bunch of Nazis. Now, I'm not calling them Nazis metaphorically. They are Nazis. They celebrate Stepan Bandera's birthday. Stepan Bandera was one of Goebbels' best buddies. They fought the Ukrainians and the Russians in World War II. These guys wear swastikas. These guys are ethnic cleansers. The best analogy, I don't think they're big in numbers, but they're ruthless. So I think the best analogy is they're sort of akin to maybe a Mexican drug cartel.
Yeah.
And so NATO operatives said, well, we'll work with the Azov Battalion. Now, if you want to understand the Azov Battalion, it's actually trivial. It is so well known now that even Google can't stop you from finding the information. But if you happen to be on Twitter, search Azov Battalion on Twitter. Just start reading. You can put a time constraint pre-2022 if you want. Okay. And you will find nothing but horror stories. Civil rights violations, massacres, you name it. They are bad to the core. And we chose to work with them, just like we work with Banana Republic leaders in South America who kill people by the gazillions, but we let them do it because we want something out of them, right? So our foreign policy behavior in South America is analogous. So name it. So the Azov guys were bad. Now, if you're Putin and you see a resurgence of Nazism in Ukraine, who, by the way, killed 20 million Russians not too many decades ago, you're going to get a little edgy. So Putin kept pushing back against NATO, and all the way up to the war, he kept saying, look, guys, you can't have Ukraine. We don't need it. Just sign here. He literally said, sign here saying you won't bring Ukraine into NATO. Mm-hmm. Now, where it gets batshit crazy is that the negotiators on the two sides are very different. So on the one side, you've got a single voice. That's Putin's. It might be Lavrov, might be some other minister of something, but it's Putin's voice. They're deciding what the message is. And I went through every Putin speech and I went through every Putin interview, and the guy is sane, totally sane. And the shit he says, you go, that makes a lot of sense. I don't know how you argue with that. And I probably provided 30 or 40 Putin quotes in which he's pleading. He's saying, I don't know how to get through to you. I can no longer even talk with you guys because you're just not listening to me. Mm-hmm. And he's saying Russia can't, it's existential risk. He says, you want to move weapons 7 minutes flight time to Moscow. We can't let you do that. Yeah. Right? If Russia put weapons along the Mexican border, how long would it take us to turn Mexico into a sheet of glass? And the answer is measured in either minutes or seconds.
Yeah, not very long.
Not very long.
Yeah.
And so, right, Putin even appealed to the Pope right before the war to say, can you get to somebody? Because this is not going to go well. So what
Yeah.
happens is before the war started, it was chaotic because no one believed he would do it. Even Zelensky said, we don't think he's going to attack. We think Biden's stirring up trouble. Zelensky said that.
Hmm.
And Macron never signed off on this stuff. And you had the Brits saying he was going to attack. You had the Chinese saying he wasn't. At one point, an official voice from Russia said, could you tell us the dates we're supposed to attack so we can plan our summer vacations? Right? So it was comically bizarre. We had, Jake Sullivan telling the press they're going to attack, and the press says, what's your evidence? And he said, well, I just told you. And they said, no, that's not evidence. You're just telling us. The press didn't believe it. I don't think the CIA, NATO believed it. I think they thought Putin would ultimately not go in. So what was the reason for Putin going in? Well, he's not going to stop NATO. What he did is, I think he went in. And again, I'm reminding you, I'm an organic chemist. So this is me pulling shit off the internet. But you too can pull shit off the internet, or you can go read what I wrote and call me an idiot. I don't care. But I wrote 42 pages on this. Putin went in to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. Why? Well, for the last 10 years, the Azov guys, the Western Ukrainians who are ultra-nationalists and nasty guys, had killed an estimated 15,000 ethnic Russians. They had been shelling Ukraine. Before the war started, I got an email from a person, I still don't know who he is, but he said, Dave, are you aware that Ukrainians are shelling the Donbass right now?
Wow.
I go, no. And someone else sent me an email that said, Ukrainian forces are amassing over in such and such a region. I go, wow, these are people I don't know. So it's just in the back of my skull going, okay, don't forget that. I one time got a reach out from a guy trying to get my attention on the U.S. military games in Wuhan in October, where all the athletes got sick.
Yeah.
In October, they all got sick. And he also said Wuhan was a ghost town. It was athletes and nobody. And I'm going, who the hell is this guy? Well, it turns out I now know him well, and he turns out to be Canadian intelligence. and he's a pretty good friend. He's also been seriously injured by the vaccine. In any event, so Putin, it turns out that I think it was in January, February, I can't remember the dates, but the shelling of eastern Ukraine picked up dramatically, and it looked like it was about to become an ethnic cleansing of ethnic Russians in Ukraine. There's a whole bunch of people in eastern Ukraine who in every respect would call themselves Russians, who would happily be incorporated into Russia, best I can tell. And it looked like they were about to get massacred. So Putin pulled the trigger. Now, his goal was to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. His other goal is that, according to one of the wonky guys who talks about this shit for many years, a lot of Western countries sort of negotiate and then go to war. The Russians have a history of negotiate war. So believe it or not, the Russians keep the negotiation open constantly. I think Putin thought that we would go to the negotiating table once we realized, shit just got real. And we didn't. And the Cold Warriors, I think, said, we got him. We got him just like we got Saddam. We've sucked him into the trap. And all of a sudden we start loading tons of weapons into Ukraine. So here's the other funny stuff. Before the war picked up any steam at all, it didn't look like a war to me. I drove my wife completely batshit. I'd watch TV, I'd watch the news, and I go, this isn't a war. This is not a war.
Pictures of different wars or pictures of, other just locations where there's fires.
Well, but you'd see cars on fire, and I go, this isn't Saving Private Ryan. This is not Baghdad on day one. Where you go, okay, So at one point I saw a stat that showed something like ex-Ukrainians have been killed by such and such a date. And I pointed out, I said, that meant that many Iraqis were probably killed in the first 5 seconds.
Yeah.
And so I was watching this, and you'd see explosions in the street that hit nothing, that looked like a stick of dynamite, maybe. I'm going, I'm sure the Russians have things that could take out entire city blocks without ever going nuke, and they're not using them. Now, someone else picked up on this, a guy named William Arkin of Newsweek, which I discovered much later than he said, if you look hard, and he had intelligence guys giving him information, he said, Russia, no matter how much you think this is true, Russia's attempting not to take civilian casualties, and they're not trying to destroy infrastructure. On the logic that they were going to win eventually, and they didn't want to have to rebuild the rubble, and they didn't want to piss off the Ukrainians and make them hate their guts for the rest of, memories in that region of the world are very long. So if you kill a lot of people, 1,000 years from now, they'll still be screaming about how bad you are. And so they weren't killing people. And then there's a whole bunch of famous massacres of Snake Island and Bucha and the train station that all turned out to be frauds. They were all Western propaganda. You say, well, Russia's great at propaganda. The U.S.'s propaganda machine, the market cap of our propaganda machine, add up all the press, all the news, is the size of Russia's GDP. If you somehow think you're getting the truth out of the Western media and you're getting just garbage out of Russia, you're not even getting garbage out of Russia because we have ways of stopping it at the border.
Yeah.
You weren't getting anything. So then you watch someone like Scott Ritter. He's the guy, historically, who sat in Congress or the Senate or whatever, bunch of people, and said there are no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And who gave him holy hell for this? Biden. So Ritter said, look, they're not there. He was a weapons inspector, former Marine. He knew this stuff. So before the war started and once it started, he said the Russians are not going to fight urban warfare. And I think he didn't say this, but I actually read a book about Putin, which I try not to do because I don't want to read someone else's story. I think it was because Putin inherited the Chechen war and the casualties hurt him politically. And I think he realized I can't be sending Russians back in body bags to their mothers. That will not work. So he did not want to fight an urban war because those get bloody. And so Ritter said, here's what Putin's going to do. He's going to fake his way to the cities. The Ukrainian defenses are going to pull tight to defend Kyiv and places like that. And I defy you to find a coherent spelling of that city. And then what he's going to do is then pull back and go around them. So while they're guarding a city that Putin doesn't want to take, he's going to go and do what he has to do. Where did he go? He went to Mariupol. Mm-hmm. As of 2014, Mariupol was the Azov battalion stronghold. Mariupol got the crap kicked out of part of it because that's where the Azov guys were. And let's be as brutal as possible. Putin intended to scrub them from the face of the earth. He intended to cleanse those guys. Mm-hmm. They were his problem. And also, Mariupol and Odessa and places like that had tactical importance in terms of a post-war world. And there was the famous standoff in the Azovstal steel mill. And these glorious Ukrainian heroes fighting off the Russians, protecting civilians. They were using civilians as shields. The Russians repeatedly said, you can let the civilians go. We don't want them. We want you. And when the civilians got out, supposedly, they were like, wait a minute. There's no war out here? They went, as soon as they got out of the steel mill, they're walking around town. It's like people are shopping. Bad shit's not happening. I watched video footage of some of the war showing the damage. And what I noticed is the damage looked old. There's sort of vines growing over the rubble and stuff. You just smelled the age on it. So what I did in my write-up, after I said this, the war wasn't what we were being told, right? Burning cars is Detroit. I said rhetorically, well, what about these horrors, Mr. Smarty Pants? And then I showed 8 pictures of carnage. And one of them was Ukraine 2022. One of them was Ukraine 2016. And then one of them was Chicago. One of them was the Inferno we call Kenosha during the Black Lives Matter riots. One of them was somewhere in the Middle East. One of them was Baltimore. But they really looked like the kind of pictures we were seeing. I said, see how easy it was to dupe you?
Mm-hmm.
It was that easy by just showing you footage. And the footage coming out of Ukraine were Ukrainian women talking about how horrible the war is. I go, I don't want to see them. I want to see the war. I want to see it. And I wasn't seeing it. Now, here's what happened. We blew up the pipeline. The U.S. tried to blame Russia for blowing up its own pipeline. Kalen Johnson said, well, to win this war, we just have to wait until Russia destroys its entire country. So clearly we blew it up. It might have been the Poles, might have been the Brits, might have been us. We had naval activities right above the pipeline the month before, so I think it was probably us. Guys like Jeff Sachs said it was us. The former minister of defense, who I watched do a monk debate against John Mearsheimer, he's repulsive. The former minister of defense is a snarky bastard. I really dislike him. He put out a tweet showing a picture of the exploded pipeline and said, thank you, USA, the former minister of defense of Poland. So he thought we did it. Everyone in the world thinks we did it, except for the most gullible. The purpose was to make sure that Germany couldn't cut a deal with Russia.
So they couldn't revert back to buying Russian energy,
which they still are. They're just buying it through China and back. But that was the purpose. I found a quote from about a decade ago from, I don't know, Condoleezza Rice or someone, I can't remember, but it was a prominent person who said that the U.S.'s biggest risk is a Russia-German alliance. With Germany's technology and Russia's resources, that would be a problem for the U.S. And there's famous Condoleezza Rice, who said to Europeans, don't depend on Russian oil. You should depend on U.S. oil.
Yeah.
I'm going, oh, no vested interest there. And then there's the famous footage of Trump warning the Germans, don't depend on Russian oil. This is risky. You're going to get yourselves in trouble. And the German contingent, I think it was at the UN, they were all laughing. I don't think they're laughing now. So in any event, they blew up the Kerch Bridge. They blew up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And then I think Russia got serious. They said, okay, this is not going the way we pictured. And they're destroying the infrastructure of Ukraine, but in the least destructive way possible. So you have a choice of blowing up a refinery or blowing up a pipeline that provides the oil. You'll just blow up the pipeline.
Yeah, so it's still
and
not
when the time,
as
well, then you just go
could...
fix the pipeline when you need it.
Yeah.
And so I actually think maybe that's what the Americans did with the Nord Stream pipeline. They might have thought, okay, don't really destroy it. I mean, do it in a way where you can fix it once we beat Russia.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there were a lot of people trying not to destroy infrastructure, but I do think they've now cut off a lot of services within Ukraine. And if you watch Douglas McGregor interviews on YouTube, he was sort of cabinet level military. One of these guys, he was going to be ambassador to Germany. The Senate cut it off. He was on the short list for White House military advisor. He's a big guy. He's been telling my side of the story. He's been talking about how, first of all, we're hearing how their tanks suck and they break down. And he says that's farcically wrong. He said their tanks are great. They've got tons of them. They've got 4 times as many tanks as Europe. And so And they were laughing about this idea that the Ukrainians were fighting back the Russians. The headlines, remember when the heroic Ukrainians were fighting back the Russians? That was the get them into the city and then pull back. The pullback part was the part that the headlines were coming our way. And what it was is, we are this close. We have the ball on the 2-yard line, and Ukraine will push it into the end zone if we just give them $10 billion more worth of weapons.
Yeah.
And we kept hearing that. And McGregor says, based on his sources, the Ukrainians are getting killed somewhere between 6 and 10 to 1. The Russians are slaughtering the Ukrainian army. They're pretty much at the point where they're bringing, like in Germany, bringing the 14-year-old kids on the front line. Now we're hearing stories about putting NATO troops on the ground. This is a terrible story. So what's the other problem? So Russia speaks with a single voice. NATO, I refer to as their army, is a bunch of loose cannons with double-digit IQs rolling around the deck. So you have Kamala Harris in Poland giving speeches, doing her Dr. Seuss imitation. Here we are in Poland, we are here. That's crap she does because she's an idiot. You've got senators saying we should preemptively nuke Russia. We've got John Bolton saying we should assassinate Putin.
Yeah.
So NATO speaks with many voices. Anyone can get near a microphone and act like a bigger hard ass than the next person. Now, if I'm Putin, and years of seriously botched politics in the United States, constantly being blamed on me, at some point I lose my shit. At some point I say, look, the Skripal poison you blamed on us, that was a bad hoax. You blamed gas attacks on Assad that were completely farcically staged. And now you're blaming all this crap on us. At what point does behaving yourself provide a reward? So if you're not going to win no matter what, then you're just going to do what you want to do. You're not going to play. You're not going to think politically anymore. You're just going to think tactically.
Yeah, and that's the scary side.
And the discussion of nuclear war is not Russia talking about nuclear war. It's the Western press talking about Russia, talking about nuclear war. They've muttered a couple of things. Like one of the lines that was muttered was, be careful that whole nuclear thing because that weather vane can switch directions. They're warning us not to do it. There are very little overt discussions of nuclear war by the Russians, tons by the Western press, tons. So I'm mad at this point. If I don't want to live in a world with a purple mohawk because we bombed ourselves into the Stone Age.
Yeah.
And we've got a demented president who's completely compromised. I don't believe that's a partisan view. He's compromised in two ways. One is he's demented. Second is he's got ties to Ukraine. He's got ties to China. When he makes a decision of what to do, you have no idea who told him to do it.
Yeah.
You have no idea. Go ahead, blame Trump for Russian ties. They've got nothing on Trump compared to what they have on Biden.
Yeah, no, it's all very interconnected when you really dig down into it, and so much there for sure. And you talk about a lot more in your year in review, the most recent one you wrote.
I've been writing about Russia since 2015.
Okay.
But just little tiny snippets that didn't make sense to me. But there's the other funny stuff. Yeah, I wasn't going to name it All Roads Lead to Ukraine. I was going to name it, how was I going to name it? I can't remember now. But they kept leading to Ukraine. So, for example, just little nuggets. Ukrainian Nazis. There's a photo of one of them with the QAnon shaman at January 6th. Selfie. Smiling at the camera. What are Ukrainian Nazis doing at January 6th? Answer that question. Who brought them there? Did the Ukrainians just show up?
Maybe they're on call when they're needed.
So we had the trucker protest. Didn't want to get vaccinated. It was the most peaceful and organized and civil protest in the history of protests. They didn't break anything. They didn't burn anything. They played hockey on the street. They were being fed donuts and coffee by the shopkeepers.
Yeah.
I did a Twitter poll and said, do you support the Canadian truckers? And I got a 97% yes vote.
Mm-hmm.
They just wanted Trudeau et al. To stop acting like authoritarians.
Yeah.
Which they were. So what happened? Well, it was time to stop the vaccines anyways. So they could have just said, okay, you win. But they couldn't do that. Because that would then show the world that the common man has power. They couldn't give them that win. It's like a parent in a showdown with their teenager. Sometimes you just let them have it, and other times you say, I got to draw the line here. So what did they do? Well, they turned into a bunch of Nazis, metaphorical Nazis, except for the fact that Chrystia Freeland has Nazi roots. She was a Ukrainian. She was running around Ukraine doing various media things. Her grandfather was a real life Nazi. And now she's on the short list to be Secretary of NATO. You go, whoa, that's kind of cool, kind of weird. You got Trudeau, whose father was the only Western leader who supported Castro and Mao while he was in power. There's a long history in that family, too, of being ill-behaved. Trudeau's actually said, I like the Chinese dictatorship because they can get things done. Trudeau said that. So then you got the Clinton Foundation, largest donor is Ukraine. You got Zelensky, who's a punk. He kicked the Catholic Church out of Ukraine. He kicked all his political opponents out of Ukraine. He shut down all the media of his opponents, all during this window that everyone's waving their yellow and blue flag. You go, let's nominate him for the Nobel Prize. The same week that he's calling the Western world to nuke Russia.
Mm-hmm.
He is a grifter of a higher order. He is profoundly corrupt. Ukraine is profoundly corrupt. His major patron, one of the Ukrainian oligarchs, owns Burisma. God, that rings a bell. Now, who has ties? Oh, right, Biden has ties with Burisma. Yeah. And then you got the GTX, the crypto collapse. GTX, I'm already getting blurry. I'm losing my mind.
Oh, FTX?
FTX. Yeah. I was thinking of GPT. Chat GPT was on my mind this morning. FTX, which is a crypto fund that came out of nowhere mysteriously. And other crypto guys are going, there's something wrong with this story. Huge amounts of money show up early. And it turns out that they were basically a money laundering scheme in which U.S. tax dollars were making it to Ukraine. And with FTX's help, laundering it back to various political PACs in the U.S. under the auspices of the Democratic National Committee.
Yeah.
And when Biden's press secretary was asked, you going to give that money back that they gave to you? She pleaded the fifth, even though people lost their life savings. If I lost my life savings and it ended up in the DNC, I'm an old man, but I'd like to think I'd go get somebody. I'm not joking. I'd like to think that someone like Colburn, the singer, said, if I had a rocket launcher, some son of a bitch would pay.
Mm-hmm.
That captures the spirit. I have a frontier justice streak in me, which is gnarly. And the system would not fix it. Guaranteed. I would dedicate the rest of my life to find a way to get even. And I don't know what it would be, and I don't know how, but I would find someone I could identify as culpable. And so, and they did stuff like FTX funded the clinical trial that showed ivermectin didn't work. What? Right? So it was a money laundering scheme. And so we know how much assets under management they may have lost. What we don't know is the amount that flowed through FTX. and ended up back in the DNC's pocket,
Hmm.
and back in the Clinton Foundation, and back in various players. So the U.S. oligarchs got a lot of money out of FTX, which
Yeah.
is why the thing played out in this very funny, screwy way, because here's this guy whose crypto fund collapsed. He's doing podcasts. I'm going,
Yeah.
you ought to spend some of your money on lawyers, dude, because they would tell you to shut up right now.
Yeah, it's kind
But
of like he knows that.
he's going to get Epstein. He's going to get Epstein.
Oh, yeah, I'd say the chance of that is pretty high with the connections he has.
Or he's too shallow and he can't hurt anybody.
Hmm.
Or, but his parents were, his family, his brother. There's this Gary Gensler. There's this whole collective of criminals,
Interesting.
and they haven't been convicted yet. But I'm predicting
Yeah.
they will. And if they don't get convicted, they're not criminals, or the whole system's criminal enterprise.
Yeah.
And you can, place your bets. I think it's a huge scandal that they're trying to make go away. I think it's a huge scandal, the FTX collapse.
It's definitely a major occurrence in the crypto world, and I think you would agree with the statement that the washout in the whole crypto space has not come close to being done with how much.
Oh, well, that's that by definition.
Other...
So let's play. Let's put the hodler hat on.
Yeah.
Well, there's 20,000 cryptos. If the Bitcoin maximalists are right, and if they're really dead on right, it is still true that 19,990 something of those cryptos have to die.
Mm-hmm.
We're not going to have 20,000 cryptos running around the planet.
No.
Just like we had, 250 car companies in the 1920s. They kind of all went away too. And so the crypto world is going to boil down to a very small handful or zero, but nothing else, I think.
Yeah, and I'm probably in the same camp as you of being a no coiner, as you've termed it, because I just don't really know how to.
It's not my term.
It's not your term. Okay. I have no idea how to assess risk, because there could be another FTX type scenario and Bitcoin goes down to who knows where. Or,
well, Bitcoin didn't get hurt by FTX, so that's the curious thing. So Bitcoin actually shined. So I think Bitcoin's going to have to go through some real brawls. I call it the battle of the bastards, right? To use a Game of Thrones model. And I could become a hodler.
Yeah.
And people think it's some price. It's not about price. I passed on Bitcoin at $10. So buying it at 60,000 didn't appeal to me. It's sort of like that ship sailed. Don't try to buy it now.
Yeah.
It will not be a price. It will be something that tells me they are going to make it.
Okay.
And it won't be to get rich. If I bought it at 10, I wouldn't even be rich now. You know why? Because it would have gotten to 100 and I would have sold it.
Yeah, you would have sold it 2 years later.
And then I would have spent the entire proceeds on psychotherapy. So I wouldn't have held it. I just wouldn't have.
Yeah.
I would have said, okay, this is a batshit crazy thing. I'm taking the money and running. And I made 700% on WorldCom and got out.
Yeah, in the .com era. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I made Dell and WorldCom. I believed, and then I got out. I stopped believing and I got out, and it didn't make me smart. It made me lucky.
Yeah.
And the sheep stock, the sheep cloning stock, Geron. My wife wanted me to buy it, and it was like, I don't know, $2 a share or something. I don't know. I don't remember, so long ago. She said, buy 10 shares. I go, no one buys $20 worth of stock, sweet potato. And so I bought a modest amount, and it went up fourfold, and I sold it.
Mm-hmm.
I said, that was fun. It was just a day trade.
Yeah.
And then it went down to a fraction of where I bought it originally. And I've only made several investment decisions that were really good. When I say good, I mean the reasoning was good. The reasoning played out. I nailed it.
Okay.
One of them was, and I don't know how I did it, so I'm not even sure the reasoning was good, but I bought a lot of gold in 1999 and it held it.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
I was buying gold from 290 down to 270 and silver from like $4 down to 350. So
That
that
did
worked
really
well.
well. Yeah.
And I bought energy stocks early in like 2001. So my best decade of investing, graded on a curve. My best decade was 1990s. I had a couple of years that were, at least one year that I was over 100%.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard to beat that decade. But relative to the world, my best decade was the knots. While equity investors were getting bludgeoned by two bear markets,
Yeah.
I compounded 13% a year. So that was good. My best, most well-reasoned decision ever was I bought the tobacco stocks right before they lost the lawsuit. And that's because I was looking at them and they were hated. They were, throw them in the trash level hated. They had PEs of like 5, 6. They were paying dividends 9 to 12%. They had survived for decades and decades. But but they got a $142 billion lawsuit coming. And then I read an article one day that said if they lose, and I knew they wouldn't go bankrupt because then they don't get paid, right? If they lose a $142 billion lawsuit, no one gets paid if they go bankrupt.
Mm-hmm.
So I said, they can't go bankrupt. I read an article, it was about 4 paragraphs long, that said if they lose, they'll have to raise cigarettes 50 cents a pack and pay off the lawsuit over 20 years. I go, holy shit, it's a tax. It's a small tax. They're just taxing the tobacco companies. So I bought a wad and put a couple kids through college. And that works perfect.
Yeah.
And then they bought a bunch of vaping companies, and I know why, but it didn't work well. But in any event, I bought energy starting in 2020 again after being out of it for about 5 years.
Okay.
And the reasoning, I think, was good. Whether it turns out to be good, I don't know, because an epic bear market will destroy a lot of stuff, right? It's a bar fight. Yeah. You don't have to be a brawler to get punched in a bar fight, right? And so a stock that has a PE of 10 and pays a dividend of 4% looks pretty good. There's nothing that says it can't go to 5.
Mm-hmm. And
so you can be hurt. The bottom deciles can get clobbered. The bottom deciles evaluation, you can get clobbered. So it's the epic bear market that's got me very conservative still. Otherwise, I'd plow into energy. I'm
okay.
And I have gone into nuclear energy.
So you're in energy. It sounds like. Are you in precious metals at all, or what?
I've got a ton of precious metals.
What other things are you optimistic about?
About 30% gold, physical gold.
Okay.
About 30%. The precious metal equities are actually pretty cheap. I owned them from like 01 up, and then they gave it all back. Now, wait a minute. Gold went from 256 to 1900, settled back at 1200. Yet you went all the way back to the beginning? Cornell was ripping a CEO of one of these companies in a meeting. I said, you guys screwed the pooch. He said, yeah, the whole industry just completely screwed up. But one of the things they did is they overinvested. Well, they now have investments. And, whenever you talk to someone about precious metal equities, they're always talking about the optionality of it. And they're always talking about the metal, the resources, and the reserves. And I go, dude, I live on a lake. I'm not a fishery. I got to find a way to get the fish out of that lake if I want to be a fishery. And I got to make money if I want to be a fishery. So don't tell me about how much gold is underneath your ass. Tell me about how much gold you can get out at what price and how much you're going to sell it for and what the cash flow is going to be. And so I had just totally said, no, equities are just for fools. Then one day, Fred Hickey was talking about gold equities, and Fred's a smart guy. He's talking about how cheap they are. I go, oh, here we go, resources in the ground crap, optionality crap. And he starts talking about balance sheets, cash flows, price earnings ratios. I go, what? And I'd lost track of them, and I started looking the ones up he was naming, and there they are. They trade like tobacco stocks, some of them.
Mm-hmm.
About real cheap, and I don't know why. I own them, but I don't know why they're cheap. The three biggest platinum miners in the world. Now they're in South Africa, which has a political risk, confiscation risk. But they trade with P's of 5 or 6, net cash on the balance sheet, big dividends. And one day I'm talking about, so one of them is Sibanye, the other is Impala, and the third is Anglo-American Platinum.
Okay.
And I did a podcast, and I said this. I said, I saw, literally, I watched a guy who I don't know his name do a YouTube with about 15 clicks on the YouTube, analyze the platinum miners. I go, holy shit. What the hell was that I just watched, right? So this was not a viral video. And so I looked into it. I said, I'm going to take a flyer on these guys. The price of platinum's gone nowhere in 20 years.
Yeah.
If platinum ever got legs, holy moly, what would happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm talking about this on a podcast with, I think it was with Anthony Pompliano.
Okay.
And some guy sends me an email and says, we're the largest private holder of Sibanye, and I'd like to chat. I'm going, you got it. and we chatted, and he tutored me for 2 hours as to the guts of the platinum miners. Long story short, they're making most of their money right now off rhodium. They're not making it off platinum. If platinum gets legs, why would platinum not get legs? Well, everyone's going to be driving an electric car, right? Well, I don't think so. And so if platinum ever gets real legs, and they don't even have to because their cash flows are great. Mm-hmm. This is one of these companies you go, look, just keep making money at $900 an ounce. I don't care.
Yeah.
And then I found out I have a cabin in the Adirondacks. I'm not a wealthy guy. I mean, I done really well, but it's assessed at $67,000. So this is not some palatial thing on Fourth Lake or anything. And I found out the guy has a cabin about 5 minutes drive from my cabin. So we're gonna get together and have some fun. Okay. In any event, he explained the whole platinum industry to me and where the platinum's coming from. It turns out the main veins appear to have come from a big ass meteor from eons ago. Okay. And they're all sort of mining around the perimeter of this big welt. And so that might be a brilliant purchase. I don't know. It could get confiscated by the South African governments, and then I'll lose it all. I took a nibble at RSX when Russia fight was about to begin, and I waited and waited and waited, and I bought some. I had 100 shares before that. I'd owned it for about 4 years because I thought Russia was a promising place to be, but I didn't know when it would become a promising place to be. So I had 100 shares to keep my attention. That's it. and then I took a bite out of some more, and then 2 days later they stopped the trading.
Yeah,
I could lose. The day I lost all of those shares. It wasn't even an unusually bad day. I mean, that's how little I owned. Mm-hmm. I know some people had a lot. Now, here's the interesting part of that story. So Westerners own big percentages of these resource companies in Russia. By stopping trading, didn't we just hand those shares back to the Russians?
Pretty much, yeah.
Except, then you read an article that says Goldman and JP Morgan are trading Russian debt. Well, there's supposed to be an embargo. I'm going, holy shit, these crooked bastards. I can't believe they're doing that. So here's what's going to happen. Here's my prediction. Russia shares are going to start trading again. Okay. But not before these bastards get in and buy them all up. And then guys like Harris Kupperman, who had a lot when they stopped trading, I think, he'll get them back, and I think he'll have some big days. Because I think all that tanking, so RSX went from I don't know, I'm going to just throw went from 20 to 2. Yeah. So I grabbed the falling knife at the very end, but then it cut my finger off. Harris, also known as Cuppy, I think he had a lot. So if they do come back, he could have some big paydays. Okay. And some other people could, or they may never come back.
Yeah.
But normally, this is not the way I normally invest. But I've been watching Russia, thinking, Gazprom and stuff. They're trading with PEs of 4. Grant Williams mentioned them one day. I'm going, oh my God. He said, you want a real contrarian play? The Russian energy companies. And I'm going, I've been watching them, Grant.
Yeah.
So if they come back, I might try to jump in day one. I might try to grab the dead cap ounce,
It wouldn't hurt, just a small position there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if I buy Bitcoin, that's all I buy anyways.
Yeah, me too. Well, I think I'll probably have to let you go, Dave. It's been a really good chat with you.
Oh,
We've covered a lot of ground.
Babble my ass off. So the one thing you don't have to do as a sponsor of a podcast is you don't have to muscle the thing to keep it moving.
No, I don't. Where can my listeners find you if they want to hear more? You're on Twitter, I know. You write a year in review. Where can they find that?
Yeah, I might have written the last one. I don't know. They're so hard to write. I got to do something different because next year I think I have a teaching assignment that's going to clog up the fall.
Okay.
You can find my year in review. If you go to Twitter, I'm David B. Collum. If you search YouTube, just Dave Collum, you'll find all sorts of YouTubes that I presume will include yours.
Yeah.
And if you go to my pinned tweet on Twitter, that turns out to be my year in review. And then on my group website, I have all my year in reviews under a section called Dave Goes Rogue. So if you I'm a chemist at Cornell. If you can't find my group website, you have flunked the IQ test. But there's a section, Dave Goes Rogue, and it's got all my year in reviews because they'd all been fragmented. And I got my student to upload them all, just to give them back to me, just PDFs of the original thing before even formatting and uploading. They're all there, and they go back about a dozen years.